have to go. Sorry, ubus laway yung nangyari sa mga previous episodes, Attorney
That's
Caranza.
okay. It's very cold here, and then kung may heater kasi, your throat
Sabagay,
gets
yeah,
dry.
sabagay. Okay, yeah, fantastic. Okay, so we discussed ICJ, we discussed ICC. In a typical, I think there's already an Carranza oeuvre, right? Which is curb your enthusiasm. I think you're like that guy. Like when it goes to curb your enthusiasm. Okay, so having said that, let's talk about a little bit the Marcos Jr. era, and some would say again, curb your enthusiasm, right? Some people I think getting ahead of themselves. Some people are misinterpreting some of the things I've written, including in recent piece called just a Journal of Democracy. Having said that, can we start with the issue of corruption? Because this ruling by was it Sandigan Bayan dun sa pork barrel, Napoles and Jinggoy. So I immediately had a problem with the journalism around it. Like every headline was acquitted. It's like, yeah, acquitted of like the higher crime, but there was still conviction on the bribery cases. In fact, two kinds of briberies in the case. But for some reason, it got lost in just the headlines. So doon pa lang nalaman ko na may problema talaga tayo sa journalism pa lang. People, so ang gandang tignan, di ba? Kaya for some people, siguro nagtaka sila, what did JV see to mean when dapat respetuhin natin yung because I think JV was referring to the conviction part rather than the acquittal part. But first of all, let's talk about this because for me to say something more about our justice system in the Philippines. So kanina medyo inano mo yung ICJ and ICC. Let's talk about our own beloved justice system. How do you read this situation?
You know, one of the last times I had an extended visit in the Philippines was just before the 2016 elections. And it was interesting because Marcos Jr. was running for vice president. This was before he lost as vice presidential candidate. And I joined a press conference called by Akbayan Youth, you know, the youth arm of the Akbayan Party, because they had just filed a case at the office of the ombudsman involving plunder and the other Napolis-related cases, but specifically against Marcos Jr. In other words, Marcos Jr., together with the other persons you mentioned, Estrada, Revilla, the other persons accused of making money corruptly from that Napoles connection, that case is still pending. That case has been pending for so long that Filipinos, including journalists, have forgotten that Marcos Jr. was implicated in that case. And that says a lot about how journalists not just need to focus on the all or nothing aspect of this type of coverage, right? Acquitted or not acquitted, guilty or not guilty, but also whose case has not moved forward at all, and why certain politicians and their cases move forward at certain points in time, but not at other points in time. And it says a lot about the court system, about the judicial system in the Philippines, that Supreme Court justices or ombudsmen or prosecutors in the Philippines wait for the turnover of presidents before they act or not act, before cases get resolved or not get resolved. It's counted not in terms of what the Philippine Constitution mandates is the period of time within which you need to resolve cases, but it's counted in presidential terms. When Gloria Arroyo becomes president, we expect this case to move forward or not move forward. When Marcos Jr. becomes president, we think the Duterte cases will move forward or not move forward. And then it's not just a reflection of the institutional weakness of the Philippines judiciary, but it is also reflective of what civil society and, in a way, you know, people who have the power and the capacity to do something about it have just simply come to accept that we expect political transitions to be decisive in the movement of significant corruption cases or significant cases involving political families and dynasties rather than the courts themselves. So just to round off this point, you know, when these individual politicians are convicted, that comes as a surprise, right? The Filipinos sort of see that as the exception rather than the rule. When they're acquitted, Filipinos simply accept that as the rule. Um, to me, I think what is important is not simply to rely on the same institution, the Office of the Ombudsman or the Philippine Supreme Court, to define what justice looks like. The reason, for instance, that we succeeded in the PCGG in at least going after the ill-gotten wealth of the Marcoses is because we took off the blinders and said, look, the Supreme Court of the Philippines, the Ombudsman of the Philippines, these are not judicial institutions merely. These are political institutions. And you have to throw everything that you can throw at both the persons you're going after and the individuals in these institutions that they rely on to protect them, to give them impunity. And there's the key threshold there. If you're afraid of doing that, if you're afraid of doing that because you have your own ambition, because you have your own family or business interests to protect, then maybe don't become a human rights lawyer, don't become an anti-corruption lawyer, don't practice law in the Philippines.
Um, I'm still trying to squeeze out something more hopeful out of our discussions. I want to end on this note. I mean, is there anything that is, how should I put it? Of course, I understand we still have a lot of reservations about the direction of things, but don't you think, nevertheless, the toning down of the Duterte era excesses, whether it's on the West Philippine Sea issue, whether it's on the human, don't you think that provides some sort of a room for the real good forces to push for some transformative change down the road? I mean, where the heck is the opposition? I'd rather ask, right? This is the question we keep on asking ourselves, because we keep on talking about Duterte, Marcos, China, US, and I wonder, okay, like, so where are the real progressive forces in this country? Don't you think now there's a historic opportunity for them, instead of, I don't know, complacency or cynicism? That's always my two concerns, either complacency or cynicism, the two evils of politics that we have to avoid.
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to, and it might sound cynical, but to me it's not, to remember that Duterte set a very low bar in terms of the behavior of Filipino presidents and politicians. Killing thousands of people and claiming they were drug addicts is a very low bar. It's just murder. It's not even any kind. You don't have to be a political genius or legal expert to know that killing people and then telling Filipinos, lying to them and saying, they deserve to be killed. Of course, you'll generate popularity because Filipinos are tired of crime, are tired of corruption, are tired of not seeing changes in their country, right? And so he just decided that's what he will do because it worked in his city, it will work in the country. And this is where the liberal opposition comes in, because this taste for murder, if that's the only thing that drives you, then sure, you oppose Duterte because you don't want killings. But then if you don't stop and ask yourself, why did killing become very popular? Why did Filipinos, many of them the same type of poor people and middle class people who were being killed, support killing? They were practically being killed and yet cheering on the killing of their neighbors, of their friends, of their sometimes their own family members. That's because the liberal opposition, maybe not all of them, maybe not a lot of them, uh, don't see the class aspects of this. That they see this as simply a moral issue rather than a social and economic issue. That for as long as there's a lot of inequality, for as long as people don't get to access justice, you get convicted for, if you're a local treasurer's office or employee who stole 20,000, you get convicted of malversation, get sentenced to 12 years in jail. But Marcos Jr. becomes president of the Philippines despite not paying taxes and despite his mother stealing billions. So where is the justice there? And so if somebody emerges and says, well, let's just kill people, then what should the liberal opposition do? So not just oppose the immorality of killing, but challenge the inequality of that society. But the second point here, Richard, and I know you were heading towards the possibility of Marcos Jr. being a better president than Duterte, which is why I started with
Less
saying,
bad.
look,
Less
Duterte set a
bad.
very low bar.
Less bad.
Um,
Let me paraphrase.
well, and that's of course obviously one reason why someone like you would say, maybe the Marcos Jr. is better because he's not Duterte, but it's a low bar. Not everyone wants to be a murderer. Certainly, not all people who become president aspire to be murderers when they become president. But there's another reason why, and again, this might sound cynical, but the reason Marcos Jr. is not as terrible as Duterte is that his his mediocrity. His mediocrity prevents him from coming up with a fantastically awesome scheme of corruption, like the Maharlika investment fund. There were other people around him to convince him that, oh, this is a good idea. This is how you institutionalize corruption and maybe even launder your family's ill-gotten wealth. Marcos Jr. does not have the kind of intelligence to come up with that. And that's the danger. That's the danger. There will be other people around him who will propose these large schemes of plunder to take advantage of the fact that he only has a few years left. And so we need to do this now, and maybe even need to put your cousin as president so that people won't go after us after you leave
I mean,
office.
Ruben, what about the hypothesis? I'm hearing this a lot from friends in China, right? Who suddenly are very concerned about good governance and corruption in the Philippines. And the thesis in China is this nowadays. When I say China, it's not just
Mhm.
Beijing, it could be the bigger China. Their argument is, mukhang Marcos daw cut a deal with Biden. I mean, for me, of course, Biden doesn't control courts, the court cases, but the Treasury Department can be sometimes more vigilant than other times in terms of going after, I don't know, Cayman Island, kind of funds. Where do you stand on that hypothesis?
A group of people asked me, and I supported them when they filed a letter at the State Department and U.S. Treasury to seek the possibility of a Magnitsky investigation involving Marcos Jr. and Duterte. And of course, it was a long shot. I already told them I'm not hopeful that unless the U.S. government itself initiates it, that action will be taken on a country that the U.S. depends on for its own military and strategic interests against China. And so, to the extent that the U.S. rivalry with China, that U.S. interests, economic and military, want to encircle China. Japan is there. South Korea is now run by some right-wing moron.
Measure Trump,
Was
Trump of Asia. Yeah.
exactly, and so you have all these countries, and well, it's a different topic whether this kind of Cold War encircling really ever works, because it obviously did not work. China became one of the most prosperous countries in the world because of that. not not even despite that. Um, and I imagine that Marcos Jr. relies a lot on U.S. support whenever he feels threatened. There were rumors of military unrest fomented by Duterte, and these are all true in their own way, right? Because the Philippines, the military included, is run by individual loyalty rather than by institutional agendas. And so when China rattles Marcos and says, we can expose you for this or that, there are two things that to remember. The Marcos family has investments in China. Some of their ill-gotten wealth was being laundered through Shanghai. So there is that. Second, the United States has an institutional structure that often and sometimes operates independent of U.S. geopolitical interests, which means it's possible that Marcos Jr. will not necessarily enjoy the kind of immunity he has after he leaves office. What happens to him then? What happens to his family? What happens to whatever assets they might want to launder in the United States? Because right now, they are keeping their ill-gotten assets away from the US precisely because of this uncontrollable factor that they can't control institutional responses from money laundering regulators in the US. After Marcos leaves the presidency, he wants to preserve that. Whether he can do that or not, I can't say yet.
But I think that brings us, well, I wanted to end on that, but I think I just remember I have to bring this issue of Chacha because, one of the things I warned against is how this Chacha could be, after all, the insidious threat to whatever is left of our democracy.
Mhm.
Because, you can really mumbo jumbo this Chacha, and now you have even Duterte people, right? Hardcore DDS people, even a Duterte or two, openly coming out against this charter change, because obviously they know one of the motivations behind charter change is to make sure there'll be no Sara return in 2028, right? And if you push for a parliamentary system, who knows? Maybe he can be the ceremonial president, Marcos Jr., and be the head of state, technically speaking, for the foreseeable future. And someone like Martin, or someone he's comfortable with, could be the prime minister, because you don't need to be popular actually to be prime minister, at least compared to the presidential race.
Right.
You just need to be the representative of the biggest party, and then work it from within, right? So how do you see the Chacha question before we end this episode? Yeah.
Well, Marcos Jr.'s father loved to change constitutions just because he wanted to come up with some legal excuse to stay in power. And of course, he never took these constitutional changes seriously because it was just him reassuring himself that he was trying to do the legal thing. And to the extent that Marcos Jr. thinks like that, that we have to have legal cover for extending our stay in power, that again is a possibility. But to me, it also tells us that there are people around Marcos Jr. who want to blur the distinction between dictatorship and not being in a dictatorship in this case, so that they just think you can get away with it because you're president, so let's change the constitution so we can keep you in power, or at least keep your family in power. But there's also another very specific thing that is in the constitution that may be interesting to the Marcos family, because it's the constitution that came out after 1986 and has a provision that says there is no deadline for recovering ill-gotten wealth. Any ill-gotten wealth passed on to the next generation can be recovered forever. When a new president comes in, when a new government comes in and says, you still have pending cases, or you still have this 2003 judgment that says everything you own above $300,000 is ill-gotten. If I were president, I'll remember that. I'll go after your son. I'll go after your grandson. I'll go after your great grandchildren, because they live off ill-gotten wealth, and it's in the Philippine Constitution of 1987, and maybe they want to eliminate that. But of course, I don't think that's their main motivation. I think the main motivation here is really to rattle everyone else, to force them to compromise with Marcos Jr. and his larger extended family. And I think finally, if there were an opening to find a way, as you said, to keep themselves in power, it doesn't have to be a change in the constitution. It can be an amendment. It doesn't even have to be any kind of change in the constitution, but simply, this is a country and a legal system that has allowed all kinds of somersaults that are really completely unconstitutional, but people just close their eyes and let it happen. So, to me, these exercises that pretend to be legally questionable are really exercises that test political acceptability. Right? Is it acceptable to simply distort and violate your own constitution to stay in power? And even if people go to court, question how constitutional it is, how legal it is, if in the end, this is the country that accepted 20,000 people being killed in 6 years. What's tampering with the constitution compared to that?
On that very positive note, Ruben, I think we need a complete separate time. I mean, for me, I appreciate it, because we need a real talk on this, diba? As I said, you have to avoid the twin evils of complacency and cynicism, right? I push back against cynicism, but I also believe that it's important for people to get a wake-up call. I mean, this idea that the arc of history bends towards justice on its own, I didn't believe in that teleology. I think you have to fight for it. You have to bend it towards that direction. You have to
Mm-hmm.
organize and mobilize towards it. But you're not gonna do that unless you appreciate how things as they stand are not gonna really move in the right direction. So I really appreciate this dose of sobriety that we got in the previous episodes and this episode. Although I hope next time we can have on a more positive note. At least compared to next time, last time, the Lima is at least free, right? I think the situation for Maria Ressa is much better. I think things in West Philippines are also looking good, based on my knowledge, etc. So, again, as I said, it might sound a little bit too, I don't know, pragmatic coming from me, but I'm willing to take 0 to 2 and then work out how we get from 2 to 7, right? We're not going to get 10 anytime soon, but I want to work it that way because my fear is if we focus too much on the zero part, then no one feels incentivized to push for reform and change because freedom is not free, right? You have to fight for it. And it's a generation to generation kind of challenge. Your generation has fought for it. My generation has semi fought for it. But the Gen Z generation, my students' generation, they're even more politically active. And because I think they also realize how much is at stake for them, right?
Mhm.
Climate change, AI, it's a
Right.
generation of crisis. So I understand why they're so emotional and strong, but at the same time, they're also very creative. They use social media way better than all of other generations, including us millennials. So thank you so much, Ruben Caranza. I hope that set you for a very positively oriented day there in
It will. It
yeah,
will. Thank you
I
very much
don't
for
want to say
having
your
me.
location. Baka mamaya may kalaban ka na naman minsan. Because I want like, should I say her location? But anyway, wherever you are, I know it's cold, but I hope the Filipino spirit will keep you warm for the
All
foreseeable
right.
future.
Thank you very much for having
God
me.
bless Ruben. And pasensya na napahaba ito. But
That's okay.
it is what
Always a pleasure.
God bless. Have a good day.